logging provider. Now, this is where a lot of people go crazy. A lot of people say, wait a minute, I can't write a provider because I don't know what DotNetNuke wants me to do. I don't have all of the requirements that I need. I need the documentation to find out where the log, what's DotNetNuke going to call? How's it going to work? Some people just go crazy with it. That's the reason I like this interview, because when you're using an abstract class, it will build all the context for you. The abstract class acts as a contract between DotNetNuke and your provider. All you need to do now, I say all you need to do, is to take these overrides, all this functionality here. It looks kind of messy on this screen, so let's go back and look at the class diagram. All you have to do is take and make some kind of functionality, even if it just does nothing. Return what needs to be returned for each one of those functions, and you have a working provider for that type. Now, how would you use that? Well, we're not going to go through that and do that. I think one good session we ought to have sometime is building a provider in 1 hour, something like that. We can do that sometime. But the idea here is, I want you to see how easy it is to build a provider. The framework is there for you. And how do you make it work? Well, let's go look at the web.config file. At the top of the web.config file, as you look, you've seen this section here. It's the DotNetNuke section group. You'll notice each one of these sections is generally talking about a provider of some kind. These are the providers that come with DotNetNuke currently. And if you say, hey, I'm going to Control F and find that. Oh, excuse me, before I do that. Over here to the right, it's telling you that it's going to load it using the namespace provider configuration handler in the DotNetNuke DLL. And then if you say, hey, we're going to Control F, find that, we find the section where it actually tells which provider. Right now, the default provider is the DB logging provider. Both of them are listed here. And you see that they have the name, the namespace, and the DLL that's located in. Each provider then can put in configuration information that it needs. Each provider can put different information after that. So you may have different stuff for different types of providers. And so you could just simply add your provider in, your name, with your namespace and your DLL, and all of a sudden you're logged. Now why would you want to do that? Well, maybe you have a very critical application that has very specific needs. For instance, let's say your log file gets full and it creates an event. Guess what? I need to ring the fire alarm or something, somebody to come fix that. So you could do something like that to fix it. If you wanted a different authentication procedure, maybe you needed two-factor authentication, you could change your authentication provider out to do those types of things. All of this is done without changing the code. That's the source code, the core code itself. In other words, you could change this. You could put in a new logging provider and then turn around. DotNetNuke 6 comes out, you could upgrade it, and there's a 99% chance your logging provider is still going to work. Now, the one thing that a lot of people don't realize, if you're used to using interfaces in abstract classes, by definition, interfaces are immutable. You cannot change it once you've published it, because they will cause things to break. Abstract classes are not necessarily immutable, but when you change them, you can cause things to break if you're not careful. So the core team is going to change these classes as seldom as possible. So the chances of it working the next time around are very high. Any questions on that so far?
You don't need to have the whole core .NET application framework to make the provider.
No, you don't
create a whole brand new project.
You can create a project. You're going to need to have references to .NETNuke. And you're going to need, and the Microsoft application blocks, and the system. Those are the only things I used out of it. The rest of it was just to show you what was there. And I'll show you a little bit about that. The next example I give, we're actually going to use just a site that was set up with the starter kit. So we'll be working in that situation. Any other questions about it? You understand how changing the provider helps. You see, what we're talking about here is we're changing how the core works. We're changing what the core is doing without affecting the source code. Now what happens if you want to have your modules participate in the core functionality? For instance, let's say you want your module to participate in the search functionality. How do you go about doing that? Well, oh, by the way, your abstract class, you could call that your API. That is your contract. I keep saying that term. And the reason I do that is the abstract. I want us to look at this slide briefly. I want to emphasize how little the architecture has changed over the years, okay? This slide, now this is an updated slide. The only thing updated about it is it looks better, okay? If you've been around for a while, you've seen this slide in an ugly green color, kind of rough looking. This slide was in the documentation for 2.0. It wasn't in 1, it came in 2. So the concept is you create an ASCX file to use in the presentation layer. You create your business logic layer, which has your custom business objects, this type of stuff. You have a data access layer. You have a data access layer that has an abstract data provider in it. Now, why would you want to put an abstract data provider in your own? Because you may need to use different databases. You may have a module that may need to, in one installation, work against SQL, and another installation work against MySQL. So this is the reason why you follow the pattern that is established in here. Stan will be covering more things to do with this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. .NET interfaces. How many of you use interfaces? Okay. Interfaces are really cool. They give you a lot of capability that you don't have without it. An interface, by definition, has no code. Okay? An interface, by definition, has no code. And what it does is, especially in .NET, but in any type of application, is when you have an interface, if your code implements that interface, then it says to another piece of code somewhere, I've implemented this, therefore you can use me. For instance, let's talk about iSearchable for a second. iSearchable. If I create a module and I implement iSearchable in my object source, then when .NET says, hey, I need to run my search routine, it says, wait a minute, this guy is searchable. I can call my functions on him. And your search functions are then used, and it works with the .NET core. So it's kind of a communication between the two. It's another contract. It's a type of API. The iActionable interface is what gives you the menu items on your modules. iPortable, we talked about briefly before. That is when you go to a module that says export content, import content. If you create a module, you should implement this. Because if you don't, if somebody says, hey, I want to go from my development site to my production site, and I'm going to export my site into a template, it doesn't get it. You have to have implemented the iPortable in your module. So let's look at this and see how hard it is to implement these. I always get the wrong one. This is a website that I created just for this session. I went ahead and created it so you wouldn't have to watch me run the wizard. and I created a module just using the add project